Okay, well, technically what happened wasn't an ambush, so maybe the old adage isn't perfect. But the end result was about the same. The top of the mountain was a smallish plateau with a bunch of science-y antennas on it, plus a growing rift in reality and an irritable demonthrope. The 3 Deathwatch Marines advanced right up to the edge of it, cleared out a last wave of gaunts, and then all 3 prepped crack grenades and vaulted up over the lip of the plateau. Neither Sarge nor Amy could see what happened next, but at least one of the grenades must have struck its target, because the demonthrope let out a mind-rending screech of pain. Unfortunately, it also let out a blinding blast of green energy, which shook the entire mountain, Guardsmen included, like an abusive nanny. Sarge wound up lying on his back, blinking and trying to remember what he'd been doing, and then flinched as something large flew a few meters over his head. He reflexively turned and watched as the object sailed a few dozen more meters, clipped a boulder, cartwheeled up in a short arc, landed with a crunching sound, and finally skidded to a halt. Sarge blinked again and idly wondered why the unidentified crashing object looked so familiar. Then his dazed brain kicked back into gear, put 2 and 2 together, got 5, decided that was close enough, and signaled his mouth. "Holy shit, it's raining Space Marines!" Amy, who was even more out of it than Sarge, moaned and crawled into cover underneath a nearby boulder. Not because she understood a single word of what Sarge had said, but because taking cover was the guard-issued response to confusion and incoherent orders. She huddled there for a second, clutching her head and wondering why she'd ever left her regiment, and then registered what Sarge had said at about the same time as the dazed non-com realized it himself. Both of them jumped to their feet and ran downhill towards the crumpled form of the Marine formerly known as Grumpy. Actually, the former was premature. When Sarge reached the battered Marine, he was still breathing and in possession of over 3/4 of his appendages. It was hard to say whether the missing foot was due to the blast, the fall, or the pack of demonic rippers that had started gnawing on the Astartes while Sarge was staggering around, but it's not like it really mattered. After some initial clearing, Amy began picking off all nearby bugs, while Sarge propped the wounded Space Marine up against a cover-providing rock and tried to decide what to do next. His thought process was interrupted when the rock exploded. For the second time in 5 minutes, Sarge found himself on his ass, wondering what the hell was going on. This time, though, the sight of the demonthrope drifting down the mountainside shook him out of it. He staggered upright and analyzed his current situation with the speed of the truly desperate. It was a complex tactical situation. Sarge was bleeding, slightly burned, and had at least one broken rib. The Space Marine was still unconscious, and was now slightly less than 3/4 intact. Both of them had been flung a few meters down the scree slope, and were now at the bottom of a 20-ish meter cliff. Friendlies-wise, Amy wasn't anywhere to be seen, and neither were the other Deathwatch Marines. As for hostiles, the little bugs in the area were dead, but the demonthrope appeared to focus on the wounded Marine, and was gathering greenish-black electricity for another attack. Finally, the only option for cover was a smallish pile of rocks a few meters away, which was way too far to drag a ton of power-armored Space Marine. It was a tricky situation. In fact, it was the sort of tactical problem that a tribunal of senior inquisitors might spend an entire day and a half arguing over. Sarge didn't have that sort of time, though, so he responded to the complex tactical situation by pushing the Space Marine off the cliff. Despite the apparent retardation of this plan, it worked. The wounded Space Marine flopped over the edge a bare second before the Demonthrope's attack hit. Instead of being blown to pieces by a bolt of green lightning, the wounded Space Marine merely suffered a bone-shattering fall and downhill tumble. This was unquestionably a win. Unfortunately, Sarge wasn't in much condition to appreciate it, because it had taken him just a little too long to shove the heavy Marine over the edge. The blast caught Sarge in the back as he scrambled for cover, inflicting a few more shrapnel wounds and superficial burns in addition to knocking him prone. He struggled back to his feet as the Demonthrope screeched in rage and, deprived of its original target, turned its metal-covered face towards Sarge. The dazed non-com attempted to stagger the rest of the way into cover, realized he'd never make it in time, and raised his carbine instead. He got off only 3 shots before the Demonthrope's eyes flared. An invisible force ripped the gun up and out of Sarge's hands, and then began inexorably pressing in on him from all directions. It was at this point that Amy decided it was time to stop sitting around waiting for the Marines to show up and do something heroic. Over the last minute or two, she had picked herself up from where she'd been thrown, found a nice firing position, and watched the Demonthrope's attack in a desperate attempt to discover some sort of weakness. Unfortunately, it seemed to lack any giant glowing weak points, and while it had initially sported some nasty-looking wounds on its front, the remains of several demonids had risen up and filled in the holes in thoroughly disgusting fashion. So, lacking any ideas for how to kill a continuously regenerating creature that shrugged off bolt rounds and grenades, she settled for shooting it in the eye and hoping it was very easily distracted. The Demonthrope screeched and released Sarge as the pulse round punched through the metal plate welded to its face and put out its left eye. It turned towards Amy and then turned and caught a shot in its other eye. As Amy had suspected, neither shot did much to incapacitate the creature, but they sure as hell pissed it off. The rock that the markswoman had fired from exploded in a shower of semi-molten shrapnel, but by that point she'd already rebased. Amy popped up from her new position, landed yet another headshot, and then scrambled backwards over a ridge of scree where she paused for a second before picking out another good-looking rock. She scrambled downhill, keeping an eye on the small ridge between her and the enemy, until she reached the rock, where she readied her rifle for another shot. It was then, as Amy rose up for her third attack, that she realized it had been really, really stupid to assume the Demonthrope would keep hovering around a few meters above ground while it chased her. Amy peeked out of cover to find the Demonthrope a mere 30 meters above and in front of her, and with a corona of green electricity already gathered around it. The markswoman reflexively flinched downwards, but it was too late. There was a flash of green light, a blast of heat, and then nothing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence and darkness, there came the horribly, horribly familiar pain. A couple 100 meters away, Sarge paused his search for his dropped carbine and listened in confusion to what sounded like the bellowing of a stuck grox. Then, after a few seconds of incoherent screaming, transitioned into a wail of, "Why is it always the fucking face?" Sarge gave up the search for his weapon, drew his las pistol, and started sprinting. Fortunately, Sarge didn't get a chance to try attacking a demonically possessed Tyranid psyker with nothing but a las pistol and his guard-issue adamantium balls. I mean, I'm totally sure it would have worked out, but the sheer awesomeness of his inevitable victory probably would have caused the universe to implode or something. So, all in all, it was a very good thing that he only got 3 steps before the Deathwatch Marines finally returned from whatever tea party they'd been having. Bolter fire erupted from somewhere lower down the mountain, and while it wasn't as perfectly aimed as Amy's shots had been, it was still enough to convince the big bug it had better things to do than finish off a slightly overcooked guardswoman. Not having anything to prove to anyone, Sarge hunkered down behind a rock until the Demonthrope had finished screeching in rage and launched itself towards the source of the fire, and then followed the sound of incoherent cursing, and also the smell of burned hair, to his markswoman. It turned out that Sarge was actually the second person to reach Amy. He arrived to find the apothecary crouched over the still smoldering markswoman, spraying her head with what could have been either synth skin or fire suppressant. Whatever it was, though, judging by the way Amy was squirming and swearing even louder, it stung like a son of a bitch. Anyway, as Sarge arrived, the apothecary tucked Amy under his arm. Sarge thought he remembered the Marine having 2 of those earlier, but wasn't quite sure, and turned to face him. The Marine started to bellow some kind of order, then paused and gave Sarge a look which managed to convey, "Are you retarded?" despite being delivered through a helmet.
"Where is your weapon, Guardsman?"
Sarge blinked, trying to think up a diplomatic response, and then decided that he was too sore and tired for this shit.
"Dunno. Where's your arm, Marine?"
After a very awkward silence, the apothecary sighed and began explaining the tactical situation. In short, Jim had calmed the Marines, ours were still jammed, and informed them the AA guns would be coming online soon. Heart Marine was distracting the Demonthrope and drawing it into a good position for all the guns to hit it, while the apothecary was trying to get him some reinforcements. Unfortunately, the apothecary had been disarmed and was running on stims. Grumpy Marine's diagnostic cogitator was reporting massive trauma and something like 50 broken bones, and Amy had been temporarily blinded. So Sarge was all there was, and he'd lost his bloody gun. Anyway, there was a bit of yelling, a bit of negotiation, a futile search for wherever Amy had dropped her weapon, and just maybe a small amount of theft. In the end, Sarge left Amy and the incredibly battered Grumpy Marine to the apothecary and ran down the mountainside armed with a far too large bolter and an oversized crack grenade. As Sarge quickly descended back down to the facility and desperately tried to avoid face-planting as he did so, the Heart Marine was playing hide-and-shoot with the increasingly frustrated Demonthrope. Sarge couldn't see much of the Marine, who was wildly dodging through the rooftop structures, but it was impossible to miss the lightning blasts, large-scale psychokinetic tantrums, and the occasional, more demonic attack that he was dodging. All in all, it looked like an absolutely suicidal fight to get involved in, especially given how poorly Sarge's own attempt to do that sort of thing had gone. His back was absolutely killing him. Still, though, Sarge had to do something to help. So when he finally reached the facility's rooftop, he propped the oversized bolter up on a chest-high pipe like it was a heavy stubber. Sarge planned out his escape path, took careful aim, fired, and completely missed. By like 30 meters. It was pathetic. In what would have been the most humiliating experience in his life, if anyone had been around to see it, Sarge proceeded to miss 2 more carefully aimed shots before giving up. He then switched the bolter over to automatic and attempted to lay down some orc-style suppressive fire. The gun, which had doubtlessly been forged by some master artisan and performed flawlessly over centuries of combat, jammed on the second shot. Swearing like only a non-com can, Sarge picked up the jammed bolter and threw it at the demonthrope. The gun sailed a good 10 meters below the demonthrope, and then bounced off a pipe and over the edge of the roof. When asked what happened to the bolter afterwards, Sarge told the apothecary that the demonthrope had used its telekinetic powers to snatch it from his grip. He didn't become aware that the rooftop's vid recorders had caught the whole shameful show, including his blatant lie, until far, far later. After spending a second cursing the stupidity of what he'd just done, Sarge drew his lace pistol and finally scored a hit on the demonthrope. Unfortunately, lace pistols aren't known for their ability to pierce demonically reinforced chitin, and the creature just ignored the pitiful attack as it continued to try to kill the Heart Marine. Sarge swore some more, tried to draw a bead on one of the warp fire-filled eye holes that Amy had punched in the demonthrope's faceplate, and then nearly had a heart attack as 24 anti-air guns opened fire from every direction. Sadly, the hail of flak didn't immediately reduce the demonthrope to an airborne pile of demonically tainted chunky salsa. The creature took several hits, enough to kill anything that could really be called alive in the first place. But before it was overwhelmed, it managed to furl its wings into a sort of shield and drop into the mouth of the crater it had originally exited the facility from. It didn't drop all the way down the crater, though. Once out of the AA turret's line of sight, it spread its wings again and began regenerating its wounds. Sarge swore at the creature's refusal to just die already, but noticed that it was having a lot more trouble healing itself than it had previously. He wasn't sure whether it was the lack of nearby demonids to cannibalize, the corpses had dissipated after the warp rift had closed, or if the creature was finally running out of juice. But either way, its regeneration was going slower. Unfortunately, it appeared to be countering for this by getting even more demony. Some of the wounds were filling in with eyeballs and tentacles instead of chitin, and the local area was getting awfully warpy. As Sarge moved closer to the crater, in the vague hope that the shorter range would let him use his lace pistol or grenade effectively, he crossed through patches of rapidly growing mutated plants, chittering whispers, frost, and other lesser phenomena. Of course, compared to the stuff he'd seen during the warp voyage with the demonthrope, these phenomena were positively mundane. He soldiered through them without any problems more significant than one of the little biting bugs that the demonthrope loved so much, getting partway up his pant leg before he squished it. Still, though, it slowed him down a bit, which meant that only the Heart Marine was there to keep pressure on the bug while it healed up. Luckily, the Marine was a big boy who could handle himself and only suffered a few non-fatal injuries during his wait. So Sarge pushed through the last phenomena, a patch of snow and ice that was actually quite refreshing compared to the local scorching temperature, at about the point when Tink finished booting up Spot. He watched with the same sense of triumph, then disappointment, that the rest of us felt when the wraithbone-armed drone impaled the demonid, and the thing still didn't die. Just like the rest of us, he and the Heart Marine decided that the only thing to do was keep attacking and hope that Spot was weakening the bug enough for regular weapons to finish the job. Sarge put his lace pistol away, spent a few seconds gauging the distance to the demonthrope and the weight of the Astartes-sized crack grenade, and then threw the explosive at the bug's back while it launched one of its green lightning bolts. The grenade flew in a perfect arc, hit the demonthrope right between the base of its wings, failed to adhere properly, and dropped off. Fortunately, especially for those of us standing under the demonthrope and the grenade, Sarge had let the crack cook a little. It exploded about half a meter under the creature, and pretty much the entire lower quarter of the thing, plus a good chunk of its back, was instantly removed. It writhed in the air, spraying ichor and screeching, and for a second We all thought that between the blast and the small arms fire, we'd finally done it. Then we noticed the damage to Spot. Down in the facility, Tink swore as Spot reported severe damage to its hover unit. He desperately tried to use the drone's little manipulator arm to grab onto something, but wasn't fast enough. The drone sank away from where it had been pressed into the Demonthrope's underbelly until it was hanging by the spearhead at the end of the Wraithbone psi suppressor. Sarge watched in alarm as the Demonthrope's wings flared larger. Lacking any more useful ideas, he began firing his laser pistol as fast as possible while screaming at the Heart Marine on the opposite side of the crater to kill the thing before the drone fell off. The Astartes responded to these unhelpful instructions by pausing for a second, and then lowering his bolter. Seeing this, Sarge began to scream something impolite, but paused himself as the Space Marine suddenly exploded into a full sprint towards the Demonthrope. The yellow-shouldered Deathwatch Marine charged forward, simply ignoring a lightning blast which ripped a large chunk out of his side. He reached the edge of the crater where, with an echoing shout of, "We die in glory!" he jumped and hit the Demonthrope with a literal flying tackle. Then, with one arm and both legs wrapped around the creature, he reached down, ripped Spot loose, and then slammed the Tau drone spike first into the Demonthrope's metal-covered face. Repeatedly. Now that was a sight to give us pause. I mean, who wakes up in the morning expecting to see a Space Marine beat a demon-possessed Tyrannid Psyker over the head with a Tau drone and a Wraithbone marital aid? Seriously, it was the single weirdest thing we'd ever seen. And believe you me, that is really saying something. All of us stopped firing and just watched as the Deathwatch Marine went at it like a giant, hate-fueled, anthropomorphic jackhammer. Each blow resulted in a pained screech and a flickering of the Demonthrope's wings, which dropped both it and the Space Marine increasingly larger distances. The Heart Marine didn't let a little thing like gravity deter him, though. He kept up his attack until finally, when they were both about 60 meters off the ground, an especially violent blow left Spot well and truly stuck. And the Demonthrope's wings shrank to little black pinpricks. We scrambled back as the pair of them slammed into the ground, with the Space Marine on the bottom, and with enough force to leave a power armor-shaped dent in the floor. Then, after waiting a second to see if anything else would happen, Doc ran forward to check on the Space Marine, while Tink ran forward to check on Spot. The prognosis was grim in both cases. Doc was pretty sure that internal organs weren't supposed to be squeezed out through a wound in one side, and Spot's jury-rigged battery unit burst into flames when Tink touched it. Even worse, when the battery caught fire, the Demonthrope's wings flared to about the size of a chicken's, and the gore that filled the room began flowing towards it. Tink started running around trying to rig up a new power source, while the rest of us began screaming at each other about whether or not we should try to kick/stab/laze pistol the Demonthrope to death. Everyone but Tink was out of ammo, before it regenerated and killed us all. We were so wrapped up in this that it wasn't until Fumbles mentally poked at us that we noticed the two servitors and a slightly oversized servo skull that had entered the room. As soon as we'd turned and Twitch had been stopped from snapshotting anything, the big servo skull began transmitting a rather nasal voice. It welcomed us to the lab, informed us we were over 2 months late delivering the zoanthrope, and asked if we'd seen the Inquisitor's rosette anywhere, as he needed it for opening the rest of the stasis units, and Doc, who still had the scalpel in his face, seized on the words zoanthrope, my lab, and stasis, and interrupted the skull. The medic, speaking quickly and rather incoherently, informed whoever was controlling the skull that if they wanted their damned zoanthrope, we needed a psi suppressor-equipped stasis unit, whatever parts Tink asked for, and another stasis unit to hold the Heart Marine until we found the apothecary. The skull rocked backwards, probably imitating its owner's shocked expression, and began to respond before Doc cut it off again with a shout of, "Now! Now! Now! Now!" This was enough to convince whoever owned the facility that we were serious. The servo skull fell silently and zipped away. Less than a minute later, one of those prison cell cubes was carried through the hole in the wall by the giant man-beast we'd seen in the middle of the fight. It was followed by some servitors carrying another cube and a wide selection of parts. With the help of the servitors and the giant, seriously, up close it seemed like a man-shaped bio-titan. The demonthrope was secured before its wings grew more than a meter long. The Wraithbone was hooked up to the cell's power supply, and since it was thoroughly embedded in spot, the whole battered drone was taped to the ceiling just above the cell's stasis field. The Heart Marine and all the organs Doc could find nearby, some probably weren't his, was put into stasis in time as well, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Then the servo skull noticed the dead Eldar and started screaming at us, which pretty much set the tone for the next few days. Well, that's actually getting a little ahead of things. At the time, we just put up with the ranting of the skull's owner, a man identifying himself as Majos Smith, and the overseer of the facility, because he was the leader of the group of servitors and prisoners that had won the big melee in the warehouse. Having your own army, including a man-beast capable of flipping tanks one-handed, means you're outspoken and eccentric, as opposed to annoying and crazy. Anyway, the Majos got tired of yelling at us about the same time Doc finished patching up the rest of us, and finally got around to removing the scalpel from his face. The tech priest announced that he needed to organize the packing, and would meet us on the surface. And then the oversized servo skull zipped off as a servitor equipped with an anti-grav pallet drifted into the room. We rode up to the top of the crater in style. A cargo pallet stitched to the augmented husk of a lobotomized criminal is stylish, right? And met Sarge at the lip. At about the same moment as we disembarked, Jim and the adepts began climbing through the doors of the elevator shaft. Jim was the first through the hole. He'd acquired a dozen servo skulls during his adventure, as well as a few holes that were leaking blood and lubricant. Sarge winced and vowed to avoid Hannah for the next few weeks. Next came the cogitator adept, who looked like he'd licked an electrical outlet, and the xenologist adept, or to be more precise, his corpse, was hefted through. Finally, the diplomacy adept, who was completely fine, climbed out. Doc ran over to give aid, while Sarge surveyed the ragged group for a few seconds, and then asked what had happened. Jim shrugged and just said, "Turret," and the cogitator adept mumbled something about feedback, and the diplomacy adept cheerfully announced that he'd shot the xenologist on account of him being a traitor. Before Sarge could get his mind around what he'd just heard, Twitch announced that he'd known the dead adept was a traitor all along, and asked if he'd been working with the demonids or the orcs. The old diplomat told him it was the orcs, suggested he go figure out what data the deceased might have passed on to the vile Xenos, and then patiently waited for Sarge to ask something less retarded. After a painfully long wait, Sarge said he'd never seen the xenologist adept do anything traitory. The diplomat pointed out that waiting to kill a traitor until after they've betrayed you would be horribly sloppy. Sarge nodded at this sage advice, asked how the diplomat had known the adept was a traitor, and immediately regretted the decision as the man launched into a long and detailed explanation. About halfway through, Tink got bored and asked if the diplomat was secretly an inquisitor or something. The remark caused the old adept to give up on his explanation with a pained sigh. He spent a few seconds thinking and then declared that he was not an inquisitor. It was far too athletic a profession for him. He was just a simple adept who'd been part of Oak's retinue since the man was an interrogator. Of course, he said, this meant he'd been in the Inquisition since before our great-great-great-grandfathers had been born, and despite it not being the administratum, seniority did still count for something. Essentially, he was Oak's trusted observer, and knew how to inquisit better than all of us put together. So we should shut up and trust him. Sarge announced that he was too tired to argue, and would worry about it later. Tink, Nubby, and even Twitch, who was flowcharting the Orc conspiracy, all agreed. Doc asked if that all meant the adept was supposed to be keeping us out of trouble, because if so, he'd been doing a terrible job of it. The diplomat said he was actually pretty happy with our performance, which was pretty disturbing when we thought about it. Further discussion on the subject of adepts was called off by the arrival of the apothecary and his patients. The grumpy Marine was looking especially ragged, in addition to a missing foot and forearm. He had enough broken bones and internal injuries to keep even a Space Marine on the bench for a few months. Also, the apothecary said something about him having spinal damage due to a 30-meter fall directly onto his back. Sarge winced, but otherwise maintained his poker face. Amy was in slightly better shape. She was conscious, moderately lucid, she was swearing pretty creatively, could see again, and was moving under her own power despite a fair number of shrapnel wounds and minor burns. Her head, though, was a mass of sprayed-on synth skin with eye holes cut in it. Doc was pretty sure that a lot of the synth skin was extraneous, though, and wagered that it was only the skin from her eyebrows up that was going to need to be replaced. Anyway, there was a fair bit of wincing when we saw Amy, and Tink, ever the charmer, pointed out that she really sucked at ducking. Twitch countered that she was actually pretty good at it, and she just had some sort of power that attracted energy attacks to her face. Nubby cheerfully pointed out that at least now she wouldn't have the skunk stripe, on account of how all of her hair would have to be regrown by the hospitalier this time. Amy reacted to these comments in the usual way. While the three assholes tried to avoid getting murdered by an enraged markswoman, and Fumbles ran around trying to calm everyone down, Doc and Sarge brought the two Marines up to speed on how the Demonthrope fight had ended, and the status of the Heart Marine. Bringing the apothecary and his nearly comatose battle brother up to speed took a while, mostly because they kept asking for annoying little details, and the diplomat kept showing them a data slate full of files he'd gotten from somewhere. Then things were delayed even further when the elevator was pried open by the giant man-thing, and the tech priest we assumed was the Magos, based on how he had the big servo skull perched on his shoulder, stepped out. As the Magos and his entourage came over, we all reacted in the usual semi-paranoid way. But Jim took it a step further and stretched his mechadendrites out towards the tech priest and his skull. This elicited a screeching burst of feedback, which made us all flinch. And then the Magos' skull sped over until it was in front of Jim's face and screeched, "Try that again, boy, and I will milk that pathetic organ you call a brain out of your ears, and repurpose your shell as a janitorial servitor." The engine seer went as pale as he could, turned around, and ran off to the shuttle. His flock of servo skulls sped towards the Magos, and then disappeared into the facility. After that little show, the Magos strolled up to the diplomacy adept, who, to our complete lack of surprise, greeted him warmly by name. The Majos responded by screaming at him about having asked for a zoanthrope, not a demon-tainted monstrosity. This ranting continued for several minutes, and also branched out to cover how even if the zoanthrope had been untainted, all of the Majos' gene-stealers and cultists had been turned into squigs. The diplomat asked if they could be unsquigged, and was informed that it didn't work that way. The yelling ended, at least for the time being, with the Majos promising to file a complaint with Oak. He then turned to Sarge and asked where the squished Inquisitor was. A minute later, the Majos' skull flew down into the facility with an inquisitorial rosette hanging from its oversized mechadendrite. There was an awkward moment after the skull departed where we all stared at the Majos, waiting for him to continue yelling or whatever. The diplomacy adept found this hilarious for some reason, and after a few seconds told us not to worry about it, and went back to talking to the apothecary about files, records, political cabals, and other such stuff we had no interest in. This continued a while, during which most of us wandered off to find some shade, /water, /smokes, etc. Sarge stayed put, though, and after a few minutes he signaled the rest of us to return. We listened as the apothecary announced that he suspected the Inquisitor hadn't been following proper disposal and investigative procedures, but the date we'd provided proved it. He was certain that the small room at the bottom of the crater was some sort of private cache, where especially valuable artifacts and samples were being stored for use by the Inquisitor. This was a grievous breach of responsibility, bordering on the heretical even. Given the nature of the evidence being stolen, the apothecary said he now believed that the mission had always been more about theft than investigation, which was probably why the Inquisitor had been so unhappy when the Deathwatch team had been signed to assist him. The diplomat smiled at this and, as if prodding a promising pupil, asked the Space Marine what he was going to do next. The apothecary thought for a few seconds and then declared that his assignment had been to assist the Inquisitor in his investigation, not to perform it himself on his behalf after he got himself killed. This set off some sort of objection from the half-comatose grumpy Marine, but he was pretty incoherent, and the apothecary just tranked him and continued. To sum up what was, in our humble opinion, a bunch of overly dramatic barracks lawyering, the Deathwatch Marines decided, with the occasional suggestion from the diplomacy adept, that they were going to just pack their shit up and go home. They would take command of the Inquisitor's ship, when it got back from futilely trying to send astropathic messages, and any of his surviving retinue, and haul it back to some Deathwatch fortress or other, where their superiors could sort it out. So basically, yeah, you guys are probably in the right here, but we don't want to get involved. We're going to creatively interpret our orders and just leave you here with your questionably legal research facility, conspiracies and counter-conspiracies, and assorted other bullshit. We'll send a new investigation over to arrest you in a few weeks. Try not to accidentally pack up all your shit and leave before they arrive. It was a very screw-the-brass response, and in that moment we all felt a very deep sense of camaraderie with the Marines. We didn't say anything, though, because even the most reasonable Space Marine would probably take offense to being congratulated on how guard their decision-making had been. Anyway, the Deathwatch wasn't going to start any fights with us, and as an added bonus, the apothecary said he'd be taking Gravis off of our hands. The Deathwatch would handle the rest of his treatment, and get him and the Emperor's scythes that we'd left stranded back to their chapter. Doc and Sarge both practically collapsed in relief, and so did Nubby when the Marines just accepted the list of war gear lost due to enemy actions. Once the Marines had wandered off, the diplomacy adept breathed a sigh of relief, and announced that it was probably time for us to know what was really going on. There was a unanimous sarcastic response, about how that would be a nice change, which the old man ignored as he explained that he could only give us the basic story. Apparently, the question of whether to burden us with the details was something best left up to the Inquisitor that Oak was assigning us to for our next mission. We all took note of that part, but kept quiet since the Adept was finally telling us stuff we needed to know. The Adept started talking about all sorts of political stuff with factions and conspiracies and schools of thought and other shit. Then paused when Tink asked whether Thorianism meant that the Inquisitor was really fond of thunderhammers. The diplomat dialed the level of detail back down a little, and tried again. After 3 more attempts, all of which ended in spectacular confusion, the old Adept took a seat on a pipe and restarted one last time. Look, ever since Oak first became an Inquisitor, he's been struggling against an enemy inside the Inquisition. We don't, or at least I don't, know exactly who these people are. But we call them and their minions the Sus Navum Conspiracy, after the name of the school they tried to build. No, not Sus Navrum. It's High Gothic. Please, stop trying. Just call them the Conspiracy. Okay, this obviously isn't getting through to you. Let's try this again with visual aid. You see this sock that I'm drawing with an inquisitorial rosette on it? Hi, I am a shadowy group of Inquisitors who have fallen under the influence of chaos. You can call me the Conspiracy. Hello, I am Inquisitor Quercus, but you can call me Oak. We are going to use inquisitorial resources to create a successor to the Cognitae, which was an evil super-heretic school for bad people. An evil inquisitorial school, you say? I'm going to stop you. Then take your plan and use it to make a good inquisitorial school. Take that! Curses, you and your retinue of brave, intelligent, and handsome individuals have foiled our evil plot. We will get you for this, Oak, and take the school back for ourselves. Not if I get you first. Take that! Again! Ha! That was only one of our useless minions. We're far too evil and sneaky for you to ever catch us for real. No one is too evil and sneaky for me to catch. I'll track you down, even if it takes me 300 years. At this point, Nubby interrupted to ask if Oak was really 300. And if that was the case, why did he look all young and normal, while the Adept looked like a little old raisin man? The Adept put the sock puppets down with a sigh and said that Major Smith helped him with that. Before anyone else could ask pedantic questions, the servo skull returned, and both the Majos and his giant man-beast started moving again. They both strolled over to the elevator and retrieved a mobile stasis unit that matched the one we'd seen in the cell we'd crammed the Demonthrope into. As he brought it over towards us, the Diplomacy Adept announced that we could get the rest of our information from Inquisitor Sysitat. There was a brief period of confusion, until the Adept explained that Sysitat had been Oak's liaison to the Majos, not the Inquisitor who'd been compressed into a ball of gore. Anyway, the Adept claimed that Oak had sent a message to the base saying we should be assigned to this Inquisitor after our delivery. Sarge looked at the orders and acknowledged that they looked pretty official, but didn't actually have any clue if it was real or not. The stasis unit deactivated, and the Inquisitor slowly sat up. He scanned the area, and then his eyes came to rest on Sarge. Realization hit them both at the same time. Oh, not you again. Amy, Tink, the Adepts, and the Majos all watched in confusion as the rest of us alternately groaned, swore and cursed ourselves for not being able to remember that Sisitat had been the name of the second interrogator we'd ever been assigned to.